A stranger at the airport grabbed my arm and whispered, "Your wife died in that crash 3 years ago." The man's fingers dug into my forearm with surprising strength for someone who looked to be in his 70s. His eyes were rheumy and desperate, and he smelled like airport coffee and something medicinal. I tried to pull away, but he held on tighter, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Listen to me. Catherine Reyes died on Continental Flight 2234. I was there. I saw them pull her body from the wreckage." My blood ran cold, because Catherine Reyes was my wife's maiden name, and she was currently at home in our kitchen making dinner, probably wondering why my connecting flight from Chicago was delayed. "You have the wrong person," I said, but my voice came out strangled and wrong. The old man shook his head slowly, reaching into his jacket pocket with trembling hands. "I have the wrong person? Then explain this." He pulled out a photograph, creased and worn from years of handling, and pressed it into my palm. The woman in the picture was smiling at the camera, her dark hair caught by wind, her eyes crinkled with joy. It was my wife. It was Catherine. But the timestamp in the corner read 3 years and 4 months ago, 2 weeks before the crash he was talking about, a crash I had never heard of in my life. I'd been married to Catherine for 5 years when that stranger grabbed me at Gate B14 in Denver International Airport. We'd met at a friend's wedding in Santa Fe, one of those perfect romantic comedy setups where she caught the bouquet and I caught her eye across the reception hall. She was a graphic designer who'd relocated from somewhere back east, vague about her past in a way I'd found mysterious rather than suspicious. Her parents were dead, she'd told me early on, killed in a car accident when she was in college. No siblings, a few distant cousins she never talked to. I'd felt protective of her isolation, grateful that she'd chosen to build a new family with me. We'd bought a house in the suburbs of Denver, adopted a golden retriever named Biscuit, and settled into a comfortable routine that felt like everything I'd ever wanted. Catherine was warm and attentive, an excellent cook, and laughed at my terrible jokes. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow that she said came from a childhood fall, and she always slept on the right side of the bed because she claimed she needed to be closer to the bathroom. These were the intimate details that made up a marriage, the small truths that accumulated into what I believed was a complete picture of the woman I loved. The old man's name was Robert Ashford, and he'd been a passenger on that flight, seated 3 rows behind my wife. He told me all of this while we sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, my connecting flight forgotten, my phone buzzing with texts from Catherine asking when I'd be home. Robert had been traveling to visit his daughter in Seattle when the plane experienced catastrophic engine failure 30 minutes after takeoff from Philadelphia. The crash had killed 83 of the 156 passengers on board. My wife, he claimed, had been one of them. "I remember her because she was kind to me," Robert said, his voice cracking. "I'm terrified of flying, always have been. She noticed me gripping the armrest during takeoff and offered me a mint, said it helped with the nerves. We talked for a few minutes before everything went wrong." He paused, staring at the photograph in my hands. "When the plane went down, I was thrown clear of the main wreckage. I spent 3 days in a coma and 6 months in physical therapy. But I never forgot her face. Never forgot the woman who was kind to a scared old man in the last normal moments of her life." I wanted to tell Robert Ashford that he was confused, that trauma could distort memories, that my wife was alive and well and probably texting me right now asking if I wanted Thai food for dinner. But something stopped me. A cold, creeping sensation that started in my stomach and spread outward like ice water through my veins. Catherine never talked about her life before we met. She had no photographs from her childhood, claiming they'd been lost in a storage unit fire. She had no friends from college, no former co-workers who reached out, no family who called on holidays. I'd accepted all of this because she'd offered reasonable explanations, and because I'd been in love. But sitting in that airport terminal with a stranger's photograph burning in my hand, I started to see the gaps I'd willfully ignored. "She can't be dead," I finally said. "I've been living with her for 5 years. We have a mortgage together. She has a driver's license and a social security number and medical records." Robert Ashford looked at me with something close to pity. "Then who did they bury in Philadelphia?" he asked. "Because I watched them lower Catherine Reyes into the ground. Her dental records confirmed her identity. I went to her funeral because I felt I owed her something for that small kindness." I missed my connecting flight. I sat in the terminal for 3 hours, Googling everything I could find about Continental Flight 2234 and the woman named Catherine Reyes, who had supposedly died on it. The information was sparse but consistent. The crash had occurred on October 15th, 3 years and 4 months ago. The passenger manifest, available through a memorial website, listed Catherine Ann Reyes, age 31, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There was a tribute page with photographs of all the victims, and when I found her entry, my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The woman in the photograph looked almost identical to my wife. Same dark hair, same warm brown eyes, same slight dimple in her left cheek. But there were differences too. The woman in the tribute photograph had a small mole near her jawline that my Catherine didn't have. Her nose was slightly different, maybe a millimeter wider at the bridge. I told myself these were the differences that mattered, the proof that Robert Ashford had made a terrible mistake. But I couldn't stop staring at the photograph, Couldn't stop seeing my wife's face superimposed over this dead woman's features. I finally booked another flight home, but I didn't text Catherine to tell her I was on my way. I needed time to think, to figure out how to ask the question that was now burning in my mind. Who are you, really? The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway at 11:43 p.m. Catherine had left the porch light on for me, a small gesture of domestic normalcy that now felt ominous. I sat in the car for 10 minutes, watching the windows, trying to decide how to proceed. What was I supposed to say? A stranger at the airport told me you died 3 years ago in a plane crash. And by the way, can you explain why you look almost identical to a dead woman named Catherine Reyes? I finally went inside, moving quietly in case she was asleep. The house smelled like lemongrass and ginger, evidence of the Thai food she'd apparently made from scratch. I found her in bed, sleeping on her usual right side, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She looked peaceful and beautiful, and exactly like the woman I'd married. But when I looked at her now, all I could see were questions. The next morning, I called in sick to work and waited until Catherine left for her design studio before I started searching. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but I knew I had to look. I started in her office, going through drawers and files with the methodical precision of a man who was terrified of what he might find. The first thing I discovered was that my wife had almost no documentation from before we met. Her passport had been issued 4 years ago, 1 year before our wedding. Her driver's license was a renewal from 3 years back, which meant the original had been issued right around the time we started dating. Her social security card looked legitimate, but when I really examined it, I noticed the paper felt newer than it should have for something supposedly issued at her birth. I found her birth certificate in a fireproof safe under her desk, and this too raised questions. It listed her birthplace as Baltimore, Maryland, but she'd always told me she was born in Boston. When I'd mentioned this discrepancy once, early in our relationship, she'd laughed and said I must have misheard her. I'd accepted that explanation because why would I question something so trivial? Now I photographed the document with my phone, my hands trembling. I was building a case against my own wife, and I didn't even know what crime I was accusing her of. I kept searching, methodically going through every drawer and closet and box in her office. In the back of her filing cabinet, behind tax returns and old utility bills, I found a manila envelope with no label. Inside were 3 photographs and a folded newspaper clipping. The photographs showed 2 women standing together, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. They were nearly identical. Same height, same build, same dark hair, and brown eyes. Twins, obviously, though I'd never known my wife had a twin sister. In fact, I'd specifically asked her once if she had any siblings, and she'd said no with a sadness that had made me feel guilty for bringing it up. But here was photographic evidence that she'd lied. The newspaper clipping was from the Philadelphia Inquirer, dated 3 years and 5 months ago. The headline read, "Local artist among victims of Continental Flight 2234." The article was about Catherine Reyes, a talented graphic designer who had been flying to Seattle for a gallery opening when the plane went down. It described her as a beloved member of the Philadelphia arts community, survived by her twin sister, Margaret. Margaret. My wife had a twin sister named Margaret, and that twin sister had been written about in connection with Catherine's death. The photograph from the memorial website suddenly made more sense. The slight differences I'd noticed, the mole, the nose, those weren't my wife. Those belonged to the real Catherine Reyes. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd been sleeping next to for 5 years, was Margaret Reyes. She was pretending to be her dead sister. I spent the next 3 days in a state of controlled panic, acting normal around my wife while secretly gathering evidence. I hired a private investigator named Franklin Torres, a former DEA agent with 22 years of experience who came highly recommended by a lawyer friend. When I showed him what I'd found and explained the situation, he didn't look surprised. "Identity theft involving deceased relatives is more common than people think," Franklin said, his voice professionally neutral. "Usually it's about money or running from legal trouble. The question is why your wife felt she needed to become someone else." He asked me questions I couldn't answer. Did Margaret Reyes have a criminal record? Was she running from an abusive relationship? Did she stand to inherit anything from her sister's death? I realized how little I actually knew about the woman I'd married, the woman I thought I'd married anyway. Franklin took the photographs and documents I'd found and promised to deliver a full report within 2 weeks. In the meantime, he advised me to act normal and not confront my wife until we understood what we were dealing with. "If she's running from something dangerous," he warned, "tipping her off could put both of you at risk." Acting normal was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every conversation with my wife now felt like an interrogation I had to carefully navigate. When she asked about my trip to Chicago, I had to pretend I hadn't spent half of it obsessing over her true identity. When she laughed at something on television, I had to force myself to laugh too, even though all I could think about was why she'd lied about having a sister, why she'd assumed a dead woman's identity, why she'd chosen me as the unsuspecting partner in whatever deception she was running. I found myself watching her constantly, looking for cracks in her performance. But that was the terrifying thing. There was no performance that I could see. She was warm and loving and funny, and exactly the woman I'd fallen in love with. Either she was an extraordinary actress, or the person I married was genuinely who she seemed to be, just operating under a false name. I didn't know which possibility scared me more. One night, about a week after my airport encounter, Catherine came up behind me while I was doing dishes and wrapped her arms around my waist. "You've been distant lately," she murmured against my back. "Is everything okay with work?" I almost broke right then. I almost turned around and demanded the truth, demanded to know why she was living as her dead sister. But I remembered Franklin's warning and kept my voice steady. "Just stressed about the Henderson account," I lied. "It'll pass." Franklin Torres delivered his preliminary report on a Thursday afternoon, and what he found made my blood run cold. Margaret Reyes had indeed existed, born 7 minutes after her sister Catherine to Daniel and Elena Reyes in Baltimore. The sisters had been close growing up, attending the same schools, and later the same art college in Philadelphia. But their paths had diverged in their late 20s. Catherine had become a successful graphic designer with gallery shows and corporate clients. Margaret had struggled, bouncing between jobs and relationships, accumulating debt, and, according to court records Franklin had unearthed, a restraining order filed against her by an ex-boyfriend named Dennis Kozlowski. 3 months before the plane crash, Margaret had been arrested for check fraud, a charge that was later dismissed due to insufficient evidence. Her credit was destroyed, her reputation in shambles, and she'd been evicted from her apartment. And then her sister died in a plane crash, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy of $250,000 and, more importantly, a clean slate. The identity swap was methodical, Franklin explained, spreading documents across my kitchen table while my wife was at her studio. Margaret waited 6 months after the crash before she started using Catherine's identity. She moved across the country, changed her appearance slightly, and built an entirely new life. By the time she met you, she'd been Catherine for almost a year. The life insurance money explained a lot. My wife, Margaret, had used it to pay off her debts under her real name, essentially erasing Margaret Reyes from existence. She'd then use Catherine's social security number and identity to get a new driver's license in Colorado, a state where she had no history and no one to recognize her. The woman I married had literally killed herself on paper and resurrected as her dead sister. "There's something else," Franklin said, pulling out a final document. "I found records of Margaret's psychiatric treatment from 6 years ago, before the crash. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and spent 3 weeks in an inpatient facility after a suicide attempt. The treatment records indicate she had an unhealthy attachment to her sister, what her therapist described as enmeshment issues, where she couldn't establish her own identity separate from Catherine." I stared at the medical records, my stomach churning. My wife wasn't just a fraud. She was a deeply troubled woman who had literally become her sister because she couldn't exist without her. "What do I do?" I asked Franklin, and my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "That depends on what you want," he replied. "You could go to the police. Identity theft is a crime, and insurance fraud definitely is. But you need to understand that your marriage might not be legally valid since she signed the certificate under a false name. Everything could unravel." I spent that night lying awake next to the woman I now knew was Margaret Reyes, watching her sleep and trying to reconcile what I'd learned with the person beside me. She made a small sound and shifted closer to me, her hand finding mine in the darkness the way it had 1,000 times before. This was still the woman who had held me when my father died, who had surprised me with tickets to my favorite band, who made me laugh harder than anyone I'd ever known. Did it matter that her name was really Margaret? Did it matter that she'd committed crimes to become the person she now was? The moral calculus was impossible. I loved her, whoever she really was. But I'd also been lied to in the most fundamental way possible. I'd built a life with someone who had erased her own existence and stolen her sister's. Every document we'd signed, every tax return we'd filed, every plan we'd made for the future was built on fraud. And there was still the question of why. Why had Margaret needed to disappear so completely? The check fraud charge, the restraining order, the psychiatric history, none of it quite explained the extremity of what she'd done. I needed to know the full truth before I decided what to do with it. The next day, I asked Franklin to dig deeper into Margaret's past, specifically into her relationship with her sister before the crash. What Franklin found in the following week changed everything I thought I understood. 3 weeks before the plane crash, Catherine Reyes had filed for a restraining order against her own sister. The petition, which I read with shaking hands in Franklin's office, described a pattern of harassment, stalking, and threats that had escalated over several months. According to Catherine's statement, Margaret had become convinced that Catherine had stolen her life by being more successful, more stable, more loved by their parents before they died. Margaret had started showing up at Catherine's workplace unannounced, calling her dozens of times a day, and leaving increasingly disturbing messages about how they were supposed to be one person, and how Catherine had taken everything that should have been mine. The restraining order had been granted 5 days before the crash. Margaret was legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of her sister. But here was the detail that made my blood turn to ice. According to flight records Franklin had obtained, Margaret Reyes had been booked on that same doomed flight. Her ticket had been purchased 2 days before departure, after the restraining order was issued. She had been following her sister, in violation of a court order, when the plane went down. "She was supposed to be on that plane," I said, and my voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Franklin nodded slowly. Her ticket was for seat 23A, but according to airline records, she never boarded. She checked in for the flight, went through security, and then never got on the plane. The implications hung in the air between us, too monstrous to speak aloud. Had Margaret known something was going to happen? Had she somehow caused the crash? That seemed impossible, the stuff of conspiracy theories and bad television. But the coincidence was too enormous to ignore. Margaret had stalked her sister, violated a restraining order to follow her across the country, and then somehow avoided being on the flight that killed her. I need to talk to someone who knew them both, I said. Someone who can tell me what really happened between those sisters. Franklin consulted his notes. There's a former roommate of Catherine's from college. Woman named Denise Okonkwo, lives in New York now. She gave testimony in the restraining order hearing. She might be willing to talk. I flew to New York 3 days later, telling my wife I had a business meeting I couldn't postpone. Denise Okonkwo met me at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, a warm woman in her late 30s who worked as a museum curator and clearly still mourned her friend. When I explained who I was and what I'd discovered, her face went through a remarkable series of emotions. Shock, horror, anger, and finally something like vindication. I knew it, she said, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee cup. I knew Margaret was dangerous. I told Catherine for years that something was wrong with her sister, but she never wanted to believe it. Denise had known both sisters since college, though she'd always been closer to Catherine. She described Margaret as charming on the surface but deeply unstable underneath, prone to intense jealousy and disturbing behavior that she always managed to explain away. There was an incident junior year, Denise said carefully. A guy Catherine was dating. He broke up with her and started seeing Margaret instead. A month later, he was in the hospital with a broken arm and 3 cracked ribs. He said he fell down some stairs, but Catherine told me later that Margaret had pushed him. Told her sister he got what he deserved for choosing wrong. Denise painted a picture of a woman who had spent her entire life in her sister's shadow, desperate to be Catherine in ways that went far beyond normal sibling rivalry. Margaret had copied Catherine's major in college, pursued the same career, dated men who looked similar to Catherine's boyfriends, and become increasingly resentful when Catherine succeeded where she failed. The psychiatric hospitalization had come after Margaret discovered that Catherine had been secretly supporting their elderly parents financially for years, something Margaret hadn't been able to do because of her chronic unemployment. Margaret convinced herself that Catherine had stolen their parents' love by being the good daughter, Denise explained, that their mom and dad had basically abandoned her for Catherine. It wasn't true, but Margaret believed it completely. I asked about the days leading up to the crash, and Denise's expression darkened. Catherine called me the night before she flew to Seattle. She was terrified. She'd seen Margaret at the airport during her layover in Chicago, just watching her from across the terminal. Catherine wanted to cancel the trip, but she had a gallery opening she couldn't miss. I told her to call the police, report the restraining order violation, but she said she'd handle it when she got back. Catherine never got back. And Margaret, who should have been on that plane, somehow wasn't. I returned to Denver with more questions than answers. The possibility that my wife had somehow caused the plane crash seemed insane, the kind of paranoid conspiracy theory I would have laughed at a month ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make everything make sense. I started researching the crash itself, reading every article and report I could find. Continental Flight 2234 had experienced a catastrophic failure of its starboard engine 30 minutes after takeoff, caused by what investigators determined was a mechanical defect that had gone undetected during maintenance. The airline had been found negligent, resulting in a massive settlement for the victims' families. There was no evidence of sabotage, no suggestion of foul play. It had been a tragic accident, nothing more, but the timing still haunted me. Margaret had stalked her sister across the country, bought a ticket for the same flight, and then inexplicably didn't board. What had changed her mind at the last moment? And when she realized Catherine was dead, when she saw the opportunity to become her sister permanently, had she felt grief or triumph? I knew I needed to confront my wife, but I wanted to control the circumstances. I contacted a detective I'd found through Franklin Torres, Patricia Nguyen, a 23-year veteran of the Denver Police Department who specialized in fraud cases. I showed her everything I'd gathered, the photographs, the documents, Franklin's reports, the restraining order petition, the flight records. She reviewed it all with professional detachment, making notes and asking clarifying questions. You have enough evidence here to make an arrest, Detective Nguyen finally said. Identity theft, insurance fraud, and possibly obstruction of justice if she deliberately misled investigators after the crash. But I need to warn you, this is going to be a complicated prosecution. Your wife has been living as Catherine Reyes for over 5 years now. She's built a life, paid taxes, established credit. Unwinding that will be messy. I asked about the crash itself, whether there was any way Margaret could have caused it. Detective Nguyen shook her head. I've reviewed the NTSB report. The mechanical failure was definitively traced to a manufacturing defect in the engine. There's no physical evidence of tampering. Whatever else your wife may have done, she didn't bring down that plane. It should have been a relief, but somehow it wasn't. The woman I'd married was a fraud and an identity thief, but at least she wasn't a mass murderer. Small comfort. Detective Nguyen wanted to bring Margaret in for questioning, but I asked for one thing first: the chance to confront her myself and get the truth. The detective reluctantly agreed, provided I recorded the conversation and she had officers nearby in case things went wrong. I spent 2 days preparing, trying to find the right words for a conversation I'd never imagined having. How do you ask your wife why she's been pretending to be her dead sister? How do you confront someone you love with evidence that they've built their entire life on lies? The morning I'd chosen for the confrontation, a Saturday when neither of us had obligations, I woke early and watched my wife sleep one last time. She looked so peaceful, so normal, so exactly like the woman I'd married. I had to keep reminding myself that she'd lied about everything, that even her face wasn't quite her own. Margaret had apparently had subtle cosmetic procedures to look more like Catherine, removing a mole, slightly adjusting her nose. The woman beside me was a constructed identity, a mask worn so long it had become indistinguishable from the person beneath. When she woke up, I was sitting in the chair across from our bed with a folder of documents on my lap. She smiled at me sleepily, then saw my expression and sat up, suddenly alert. "Daniel? What's wrong?" I opened the folder and pulled out the first photograph, the one of her standing with her arm around her twin sister. "I know, Margaret," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. "I know everything." The color drained from her face so completely she looked like a corpse. For a long moment she didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at the photograph with an expression I couldn't read. Then she started to cry. Not dramatic sobs, just silent tears streaming down her face as she looked at the picture of herself with the sister she'd impersonated. "How?" she whispered. I told her about the stranger at the airport, about the investigation, about everything I'd learned. As I talked, she seemed to shrink into herself, becoming smaller and more fragile with each revelation. When I mentioned the restraining order, she flinched like I'd hit her. "That wasn't," she started, then stopped. "It wasn't what you think. Catherine and I, we were complicated. Everything between us was always complicated." "Then explain it to me," I said. "Explain why you became her. Explain what really happened." Margaret, because that's who she was now in my mind, pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. She looked young and lost and terrified, nothing like the confident, capable woman I'd thought I'd married. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she began. "You have to believe me, Daniel. I never planned to take Catherine's life. It just happened after she died, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it." The story came out slowly, painfully, with long pauses where she seemed to be deciding how much truth to tell. Margaret admitted to the stalking, to the restraining order, to following Catherine to the airport that day. She'd bought a ticket for the same flight because she'd convinced herself that if she could just talk to Catherine one more time, she could fix everything between them. "I was sick," she said. "I know that now. I was so convinced that Catherine had stolen my life that I couldn't see anything else. I thought if I could just make her understand how much she'd hurt me, she'd apologize and we'd be sisters again." But Margaret never got on that plane. She'd been sitting at the gate, watching the other passengers board, when she'd had what she described as a moment of clarity. "I realized what I was doing," Margaret said. "I realized I was about to violate a court order and probably get myself arrested. And I thought about what that would mean. My life was already destroyed. The fraud charges, the debts, the restraining order. If I got on that plane and confronted Catherine, I'd end up in jail. So I walked away. I went to a bar in the airport and got drunk instead. I was sitting there drinking when the news came on about the crash." She started crying harder now, ugly sobs that shook her whole body. "I watched it on the television above the bar. The footage of the wreckage, the list of victims. And when they said Catherine's name, I felt something break inside me. My sister was dead, and the last thing she'd felt toward me was fear. She died being afraid of me." The guilt and grief had been overwhelming, Margaret said. She'd spent weeks in a dissociative fog, barely eating, unable to work, convinced that she'd somehow caused the crash by being at the airport, by making Catherine afraid, by being herself. And then, slowly, a terrible idea had taken hold. Catherine was dead. Margaret's life was destroyed. But Catherine's identity was intact, her credit clean, her reputation untarnished. What if Margaret could simply become Catherine and escape all the wreckage she'd made of her own existence? "It was so easy," Margaret whispered. "We were twins. We had the same birth certificate information, the same family history. I just had to get new documents in her name and move somewhere no one knew either of us. I told myself I was honoring her memory by becoming her. I told myself she would have wanted me to have a second chance." She looked at me with those familiar brown eyes, her sister's eyes, and I saw years of buried pain. "And then I met you, and you were so kind and so good, and you looked at me like I was worth something. For the first time in my life, someone loved me for who I was. Except you didn't know who I was at all." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd fallen in love with a woman who was pretending to be someone else, and she'd found happiness by being anyone other than herself. We'd built 5 years on a foundation of fraud, and somehow it had still felt real. Maybe it had been real, in its own twisted way. "I kept meaning to tell you," Margaret continued. Every anniversary, every Christmas, I'd promise myself that this would be the year I confessed. But I was so afraid you'd leave me. And honestly, I'd been Catherine for so long that Margaret felt like a stranger. I didn't want to be her anymore. I wanted to be the person you loved. Detective Nguyen had heard everything through the recording device I was wearing. She came to the house an hour later with 2 officers to take Margaret into custody. My wife, my Margaret, went quietly, not resisting as they put her in handcuffs. She looked at me one last time before they put her in the car. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's not enough, but I'm sorry. Everything I felt for you was real. That wasn't a lie." I couldn't respond. I just watched them drive away with the woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved, the woman who'd never really existed at all. The next few months were a legal nightmare. Margaret was charged with identity theft, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of filing false documents. She pled guilty to all charges as part of a deal that avoided a lengthy trial. Her lawyer, a public defender named Richard Tanaka, who seemed genuinely sympathetic to her case, argued for leniency based on her psychiatric history and the trauma of losing her sister. The judge sentenced her to 18 months in federal prison and 3 years of supervised release. Our marriage was annulled since she'd signed the certificate under a false name, meaning in the eyes of the law, I'd never been married at all. All those years, all those memories, reduced to a legal nullity. I testified at her sentencing hearing, though I wasn't required to. I told the judge about the woman I'd known, the kindness and warmth and love that had seemed so genuine. I didn't ask for leniency or demand harsh punishment. I just wanted someone to understand that this situation defied easy categorization, that Margaret was neither a monster nor an innocent victim, but something more complicated. The judge thanked me for my statement and sentenced her anyway. I was allowed one final meeting with Margaret before she was transferred to federal prison. We sat across from each other in a small room at the county jail, a reinforced window between us. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished in her orange jumpsuit. "I thought you should know," she said. "I called Catherine that morning, before the flight. She didn't answer, but I left a voicemail saying I was sorry, and I hoped one day she could forgive me. She never got to hear it, obviously, but I wanted you to know I was trying to change. Even before the crash, I was trying to be better." I didn't know if I believed her. I didn't know if it mattered. Catherine Reyes was dead, Margaret Reyes was going to prison, and I was left to figure out what my life meant now that everything I'd believed about it was wrong. The aftermath of Margaret's arrest was its own kind of disaster. The story made local news, then national news when some reporter figured out the connection to the plane crash. My face was suddenly everywhere, the unwitting husband who'd married an identity thief. Journalists camped outside my house. Former co-workers sent messages that ranged from sympathetic to suspicious. Someone started a Reddit thread titled, "Did he really not know?" questioning how I could have lived with Margaret for 5 years without realizing something was wrong. I considered telling my side of the story publicly, but my lawyer, a sharp woman named Alicia Brennan, who specialized in reputation management, advised against it. "Anything you say will be dissected and twisted," she warned. "The best thing you can do is stay quiet and let the news cycle move on." She was right, of course. Within a month, some other scandal had captured public attention, and I was able to slip back into anonymity. I sold the house and moved to an apartment downtown. I couldn't stand being in the space we'd shared anymore, surrounded by memories that were now tainted by lies. Biscuit came with me, the only innocent party in this whole mess. I'd walk him through the city at night, unable to sleep, turning everything over in my mind. Robert Ashford, the old man from the airport who'd started this whole nightmare, reached out to me a few months after Margaret's sentencing. He'd seen the news coverage and wanted to make sure I was okay. We met for coffee, 2 strangers bound together by the same tragic flight. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd never stopped you at the airport," he said. "You might have gone your whole life never knowing." I'd thought about that too, probably more than was healthy. Would ignorance have been better? I'd had 5 happy years with a woman I loved, even if that woman was a fiction. Maybe the truth hadn't set me free so much as destroyed something that, despite its false foundation, had still been beautiful. "I'm glad you told me," I said, and I meant it, mostly. I deserved to know who I was really married to. Robert nodded slowly. "I think Catherine would have wanted that too. She seemed like someone who valued honesty. The real Catherine, the one who died on that plane, the one I'd never known at all. Sometimes I looked at the photographs I'd found in Margaret's files and tried to see the differences between the sisters. The mole, the nose, the small details that distinguished them. But mostly what I saw was the same face, the same smile, sisters who'd loved and resented each other in equal measure, and whose lives had become impossibly tangled. I started therapy 6 months after Margaret went to prison, working with a psychologist named Dr. Nina Fraser, who specialized in trauma and betrayal. She helped me understand that my feelings were complicated because the situation was complicated. I'd been victimized by a fraud, but I'd also experienced genuine love with the woman who'd deceived me. Both things could be true simultaneously. "The person Margaret became when she was with you," Dr. Fraser said during one session, "that person wasn't entirely fake. She was who Margaret wanted to be, who she wished she could have been all along. You fell in love with Margaret's idealized self, the version of her that was free from all the pain and failure of her past. It was a strangely comforting thought. The woman I'd loved had been real in some sense, even if her name and history weren't. Maybe that was why I couldn't bring myself to hate her, even after everything. I'd seen something genuine underneath all the lies, a person who desperately wanted to be better than she'd been. Margaret served 14 months of her 18-month sentence and was released on good behavior. I know because I tracked her case obsessively, reading every parole report and legal filing. She moved to a halfway house in Arizona under her real name, required to check in with a parole officer weekly, and forbidden from using any identity other than her own. I drove to Arizona 9 months after her release. I didn't plan to, exactly. I was visiting an old college friend in Phoenix and found myself looking up the halfway house address, getting in my car, driving to the neighborhood where Margaret was supposedly rebuilding her life. I sat outside for an hour trying to decide what I wanted. Closure? Confrontation? Some kind of understanding that would make the past 5 years make sense? I never went inside. I saw her through the window of a small coffee shop across the street, working behind the counter in a green apron. She looked older, thinner, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But she was smiling at a customer. That familiar warm smile I'd loved, and I realized that whoever she was now, whoever Margaret Reyes had finally become, it wasn't my business anymore. I drove back to Phoenix without making contact. I told my therapist about it at our next session, and she said it was progress, being able to see Margaret and choose not to engage. "You're letting go," Dr. Fraser said. "Not forgetting what happened, but accepting that you can't change it." It wasn't closure, exactly, but it was something. Permission, maybe, to move forward without understanding everything. To accept that some questions would never have satisfying answers. 3 years after that day at the airport, I met someone new. Her name was Lindsay, a veterinarian with 2 kids from a previous marriage and a past she was upfront about from the beginning. Our third date, she told me about her ex-husband's gambling addiction, the bankruptcy, the painful divorce. "I figure you should know the worst stuff early," she said, "before you get invested." I told her about Margaret that same night. Not all of it, just the broad outlines. My wife had been living under a false identity. Our marriage had been annulled. I'd spent the years since trying to put my life back together. Lindsay listened without judgment, then reached across the table and took my hand. "That sounds incredibly hard," she said. "I'm sorry you went through that." It was such a simple response, but it was exactly what I needed. Not pity, not suspicion, just acknowledgement. We've been together 2 years now. I moved into her house with the kids, and Biscuit has finally forgiven me for uprooting his life again. Sometimes I still think about Margaret, wonder how she's doing, whether she's found some version of peace. The anger has faded into something more like sadness, grief for the relationship I thought I'd had and the person I thought I'd known. Last month, I got a letter forwarded from my old address. No return address, but I recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately. She'd written to tell me she was doing better, that she'd completed intensive therapy and made amends with some people from her past. She said she thought about me often and hoped I'd found happiness. The letter ended with a single line that made my eyes burn. "Thank you for loving me, even though it was never really me you were loving. For a while, you made me believe I could be someone worth loving." I didn't respond. I'm not sure what I would have said. But I kept the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in a box with other mementos from that chapter of my life. The photographs, the newspaper clippings, the annulment papers. Evidence of a marriage that legally never existed, but that shaped who I am in ways I'm still discovering. A stranger at the airport grabbed my arm and told me my wife had died 3 years earlier. It turned out he was both right and wrong. The woman whose name I'd married, whose identity I'd shared a life with, had died on that plane. But the woman I'd actually lived with, the complicated, damaged, yearning person underneath the stolen name, she was still out there somewhere, finally being herself. I don't know if there's a moral to this story. Sometimes people lie about who they are because they're predators. Sometimes they lie because they're running from pain so profound that being anyone else seems better than being themselves. Margaret was the latter, I think. She'd spent her whole life wanting to be her sister, and when fate gave her the opportunity, she'd taken it. The crime was real, but so was the love, at least from where I stood. My therapist says that's the hardest kind of betrayal to heal from, the kind that came from a person who genuinely cared about you but couldn't stop hurting you anyway. She's probably right. But I'm healing anyway, day by day, building a new life with a woman who tells me the truth, even when it's hard. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you listening. I know it's a strange story, the kind that sounds made up even though it happened, but I wanted to share it because someone out there might need to hear that you can survive the unimaginable. That discovering your whole life was a lie doesn't mean you can't build something true afterward. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.